Hello to the planet, or at least those interesting parts of the planet that have the internet. My name is Trevor and I'm a huge nerd. And yesterday I watched a lecture entitled The Mystery of Consciousness given by Dr. Susan Blackmore, which you should watch because it's in my pants. But in it she described an experiment designed to test dualism. Now I don't think it can, and I'll get into why later. But first I'll describe the experiment. So you're brought into a laboratory with some sort of visual stimulus that keeps changing in front of you. The actual stimulus is changed from experiment to experiment because it's been replicated, but for our purpose, we can imagine it as a clock designed to go really, really fast. And the setup for the experiment is that you put your arm out like this, and at a time that you choose, you flip your wrist like that. So, three measurements were taken in the experiment. One is when you actually flip your wrist. One is what state the visual stimulus was in when you decided to flip your wrist. You just ask the person that. And the third requires a little bit of explaining. There is a strip through your brain about here called the motor cortex. And it's basically a mid-level executive in the decision-making process of whether to move stuff. And before you make a movement, what's called a readiness potential, a voltage, can be measured in your motor cortex. So the question the experimenter was asking was, obviously the motion itself happens after both of the other measurements, but do you decide to move first, or does the readiness potential happen first? In other words, does your decision to move, or at least is it plausible to believe that your decision to move was caused by the readiness potential, or that it caused the readiness potential? Uh, so I'll tell you the results. The results every time are that the readiness potential happens first, and the decision, the seeing the thing in the state, happens about 200 milliseconds later. Uh, Now, this is probably not surprising to a lot of people with some background knowledge of neuroscience. It turns out that your consciousness often makes ad hoc explanations for the things other parts of your brain does. And so you might expect that the readiness potential happens first. You might also suspect that because you make a lot of movements all the time, some of them you're not even consciously aware of, so that when you become consciously aware of them, you assign some explanation to them. Your consciousness does. Here's a complication, though, is that in this particular case, your consciousness was pre-involved because of the planning involved in being told to put out your hand and do this. The fact that there's a setup like that implies that maybe your consciousness was part of this movement from the beginning, even though it's not part of all movements. I still have, even though it's logical, though, even though it makes sense with what we know about neuroscience, I have two pretty serious problems with this experiment. They are that there are two delays for when you perceive that you decide to make the movement. So the first problem, well, this one isn't really a problem, but it's worth noting that you can't really see more than 15 or 16 frames a second very easily. So in all probability, you can only localize this to 50 or 60 or 70 milliseconds, which when the effect is 200 milliseconds is kind of a big quantum to have. But that doesn't matter. What does matter is it's not clear to me how long it takes for the information about the stimulus to come from your eye to go back to the back of your head and then forward to the front of your head. The visual processing starts in the back. Well, the complex visual processing starts in the back anyway. And it then has to go to the front because that's where we believe all this awareness stuff happens. And we don't really know how long that takes because we don't measure the awareness of visual stimuli. You can only measure when somebody says they're aware of it, which takes even more time because then it has to go to the speech center and out your mouth, and so that complicates things. Uh, in in addition to that, there's an even more interesting complication, and that is that your awareness of the decision to move cannot have happened at the same time as the actual decision to move. It must happen afterwards. Because your awareness has to be based on the decision to move, which means that the actual decision has to take place before your awareness for the awareness to be accurate. And these are two delays both in the same direction that will systematically bias the experiment. So do these add up to 200 milliseconds? The important thing is that nobody knows. Nobody knows when you become aware of visual stimuli, and nobody knows the difference between making a decision and becoming aware of it either. So because of these, there is a systematic bias in the experiment in the direction that perhaps the will to move actually comes first. So in order to actually answer the question, right, you would have to look at the potentials that caused the readiness potential. And there were some. And you'd have to ask a question about those potentials. You would have to ask, are they integrated in this large thing in the brain that we call consciousness, or are they just isolated signals from somewhere? If they were just isolated signals from somewhere, then it's possible or probable indeed that the will to move actually comes after you decide to move in your motor cortex and the decision itself is made there. Uh, if if on the other hand these these signals are integrated into this big bunch of signals that we call consciousness, then it's reasonable to believe that the will to move actually came first. And obviously, if you go back far enough, you're going to encounter the will, because as I've described, the movement is set up consciously. You're asked to do this with language coming from somebody, and your conscious has to decide, okay, I'll put out my arm, okay, I'll flip it at some time. So obviously, if you go back far enough, you'll hit the consciousness on this one. But the question is, after that point, does the decision, do the potentials that physically cause the readiness potential, are they part of the consciousness or not? And we're not going to be able to answer that question until we actually understand what patterns of signals mean consciousness in the brain, and that's probably going to be some time. So I don't really think this can answer the question of whether the will came first or whether the decision came first. But it's even more interesting than that. If you believe in dualism, right, you might be able to believe that the awareness of the decision and that the decision happened at the same time, and that means the only delay you worry about is the information getting to the from the eyes to where you make the decision. Which to me seems unlikely to be 200 milliseconds, but nobody really knows. So But the thing about dualism is when we talk about dualism, we talk about Cartesian dualism, the Rene Descartes idea that there's the thinking stuff and then there's just all the other matter stuff. And it's interesting because this is a very complex idea, and it's formed out of many other ideas. To me, the most simplest form of dualism would be that there are two different kinds of matter and they can't really interact with each other. And whether one thinks or not, who knows? And that appears to be the case, right? It seems like there's a lot more dark matter in the universe than regular matter, and it only interacts gravitationally, and that's not really an interaction because it's based on the space-time, not on the matter itself. Uh, well, unless the dark matter interacts with the weak nuclear force, which is also I'm not getting into that. But then you can ask the question. After that, is one set to the thinking stuff? And it appears that one is. What we call ordinary matter, the stuff you're made out of, seems to be the thinking stuff, and dark matter seems to be what most of the universe is actually made out of. Uh, so, but the specific Cartesian dualism can, of course, be tested by this experiment, and is probably disproven by it, and also a bunch of other things. But there are more rudimentary forms of dualism that I don't think you can really test this way. So those are my basic thoughts on the experiment. Is that it can more or less disprove Cartesian dualism, but not more abstract, simpler forms. All right, have a good day.